now. I am standing at the podium at my father's funeral, holding my husband's phone in my hand. In front of me is a room full of people who loved my dad, his old friends, his neighbors, the men he used to fish with, my mother's sister, faces I have known my whole life. And in the third row, beside my husband, sits a woman he introduced to me an hour ago as just a colleague who came to support him. She is not a colleague. And in about 90 seconds, every person in this room is going to understand exactly who she is, not because I am going to scream or throw anything or make a scene at my father's funeral, but because of something my father did before he died, and something I am holding in my open hand. Then, 18 months earlier, my father held my hand from a hospital bed and said the last fully clear thing he ever said to me. He said, "Gracie, promise me you'll open your eyes." I thought he meant the future. I thought he was being sentimental, the way sick people sometimes get. I didn't understand that he was talking about the man sitting out in the waiting room, my husband who, even in that moment, was texting her. This is the story of those 18 months, the ones I spent completely blind, and the ones my father, dying, spent quietly making sure that when I finally opened my eyes, I would already be standing on solid ground. 2 timelines, and they meet at one podium with a phone in my hand, in the most important sentence I have ever said out loud. Before I tell you the rest, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Has someone in your family ever seen the truth about your relationship before you could see it yourself? A parent, a sibling, an old friend, someone who watched quietly and tried, gently, to warn you? And when they did you listen? Or did you defend the very person they were worried about? Be honest, because I defended mine. For years, I told my father he didn't understand, and I would give almost anything now to have listened to him sooner. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Let me take you back to the beginning. Then, my father, Walter, was a quiet, careful man. He wasn't loud. He wasn't rich. He wasn't the kind of person who walked into a room and took it over. He built a small, steady life through patience and good judgment and decades of getting up early, and he loved me in that undramatic way that you only fully understand once it's gone by showing up. Every time, without ever needing to be thanked for it. When I was a girl, he taught me to check the oil in my car, to read a contract before I signed it, to never let anyone rush me into a decision that would outlast the pressure they were putting on me. "Slow down, Gracie," he used to say. "The right answer can wait an afternoon." When I married David, my father shook his hand and smiled and gave a kind toast. But I caught the look on his face during the reception, a look I would come to know well over the next several years, and never fully understand until it was too late. It was the look he used to get when he was reading a contract that was worded a little too perfectly. He never said a single unkind word about my husband, not once, but he watched him. The way careful men watch a deal that looks good on paper but doesn't quite add up underneath. David was charming. He was ambitious, quick, the kind of man who was always about to do something big, the next job, the next deal, the next idea that was finally going to be the one. People liked him instantly. I liked him instantly. And for a long time, I was genuinely happy. I told myself my father just didn't understand modern marriages, that he was old-fashioned, that David's distance was the cost of ambition, and his late nights were the price of building the life we both wanted. Now, at the funeral, when David arrived late, of course, even to this, he walked in beside her. Renee, a woman I half recognized, because David had introduced her to me once or twice, always a little too casually, as someone from work. He came up to me at the door in front of my mother's old friends and leaned in and whispered that Renee had come to support him, because he knew today would be hard on him, He said that to me, at my own father's funeral, and I just nodded, and thanked her for coming and showed them to their seats. Because by then, I had spent a year and a half mastering the single most useful skill of my life, how to look like a woman who has no idea. Then, because 18 months before that funeral, my father got sick. And when a family gets news like that, everything becomes very clear, very fast about every single person in it. I more or less moved into the hospital. I was there every day, before work and after, on weekends, through every test and every scan and every long, careful, terrible conversation with doctors who chose their words like they cost money. I learned the rhythm of that place. The vending machines, the good nurse on the night shift, the chair that folded almost flat. I held my father's hand through things no daughter wants to watch her father go through, and I did it gladly, because he had held mine my whole life. And David was busy. Work was demanding. He'd come by for 20 minutes and spend 18 of them on his phone. He missed the first surgery. He had a meeting that couldn't move. He missed the night my father's heart did something frightening and a team came running, and I stood in the hallway alone shaking, calling a husband who did not pick up. He always told me afterward, swamped, and I made excuses for him. To my own dying father's face, I made excuses for the man who couldn't be bothered to sit in a waiting room. And my father, even then, even that sick, would look at me with those careful eyes and squeeze my hand and say, "You're carrying all of this by yourself, Gracie. I want you to notice that you're carrying it by yourself." I thought he was telling me I was strong. I would smile and say, "I've got you, Dad." I know now he was telling me something else entirely. He was trying, in the only way a dying man can, to get me to look at what was right in front of me. Now, standing at that podium, I looked down at the phone in my hand, and I thought about how it even got there, because I want to be very clear that I did not steal it. David handed it to me himself, 10 minutes before the service started. "Hold this for me, would you?" he said, patting his pockets, looking for his sunglasses. The way you hand your spouse your phone 1,000 times across a marriage, without a flicker of thought, because they are the one person on earth you trust to hold it. He handed me his phone at my father's funeral and walked off to find his seat next to her. That trust, that thoughtless, automatic. 9 years of marriage trust was the last mistake of our marriage, and he made it himself. Then, here is the moment the blindness finally ended. It was about 4 months before my father died. I'd come home early from the hospital, gray with exhaustion, and David didn't hear me come in, because he was on a call in the next room. And I heard him laugh. I want you to understand something about that laugh. It was warm. It was easy. It was intimate. It was a laugh I had not heard him aim at me in years, the kind of laugh you only give someone you're delighted by. And then I heard him say, low and comfortable, "I know. I know. As soon as the old man's gone and the estate's settled, everything changes for us. Just be patient a little longer." The old man. My father. Lying in a hospital bed with tubes in his arm. And my husband was in our kitchen, laughing with another woman, talking about my father's death like a date circled on a calendar. A milestone in a plan. I want to tell you that I felt rage in that moment. I didn't. What I felt was the floor going cold and quiet underneath me. That's strange. Total clarity that arrives in the half second before the pain does. The way the air goes still right before thunder. And in that stillness, I did the single most important thing I did in this entire story. Nothing. I backed out of the house, silently. I stood on the porch for a moment. Then I walked back in loudly, jingling my keys, calling his name like I'd just arrived. He came out of the bedroom, phone already away, and asked how my dad was doing. I told him. He sighed about how swamped he'd been at work. And I looked at the man who had just called my dying father the old man, and I said, "You poor thing. You work so hard." Because in that half second of stillness, I had understood everything I needed to. The moment David knew that I knew, I would lose. He would coordinate with her. He would clean up his messages. He would get a lawyer and get his story straight and turn it into my word against his. But right now, he believed he was the only person in our marriage holding a secret and a plan. And that belief, his absolute certainty that I was exactly as blind as I'd always been, was the single most valuable thing I owned. So I decided to protect it. I decided to keep being the wife who had no idea, for exactly as long as it took. There is one afternoon from the hospital I will never forget, and it's the one that turned my grief into resolve. My father was having a bad day, a frightened day, and he asked in a small voice that broke my heart, because my father was never small whether David could come and sit with us, because he didn't want me to be alone if something happened that night. I called David. I told him my father had asked for him, and David said he'd try, but that he had a thing, and the thing I would later confirm from the folder was a dinner with Renee. My father waited up for a son-in-law who never came, and at some point he patted my hand and said, "It's all right, Gracie. It's just you and me. It's always really been just you and me." And he smiled when he said it, to make me feel better. That was the night I stopped grieving the marriage I thought I had, and started quietly building the exit from the one I actually had. Because I didn't only build a folder. The week after that overheard phone call, while David thought I was at the hospital, I went and sat across from a divorce attorney of my own, not to file anything. Not yet, but to learn exactly where I stood, the way my father would have told me to. I told her everything. She listened. And she said something I held on to for months. She said, "Most people in your position blow it up the first week. The confrontation, the screaming, the scene, and then they spend 2 years and most of their savings cleaning up the mess they made just to feel right. You haven't done that. You've kept your head, and you've kept records. When the time comes, you won't be reacting. You'll be ready." So I got ready. And that night, I started a folder. If this story is hitting close to home for you, if you've ever been the one carrying everything while someone else quietly planned around you, do me one quick favor before I go on. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm, slow burn revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage. And your one tap is genuinely the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is, tonight, defending the wrong person to someone who loves her. And believe me, what I found in that folder, and what I learned about my father after he was gone, is the part that changes everything. Then the folder wasn't a metaphor. It was a real one, on an account David couldn't reach. And over the following weeks, I filled it the way my father taught me to do anything that needed to hold weight later, slowly and carefully. I read the truth of my own marriage in order, like a stranger reading someone else's file. The cloud that backed up both our phones, the one shared thing in 9 years of marriage that had never once been a secret. Which is exactly why he never thought to check it, handed me everything. The affair with Renee had been going on for over a year. I matched it to dates. I found the work trips that lined up with weekends I'd spent at the hospital. I found a hotel charge from the same week my father had his first surgery, the surgery David missed for a meeting that couldn't move. I found the anniversary, our anniversary, when he'd given me a card and a rushed dinner and then 2 days later taken her somewhere far nicer. I went back through 18 months of my own life and watched it rearrange itself into a story I hadn't been allowed to read while I was living it. And the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the timing of it. Every cruel thing in those messages was scheduled around my father's decline. They didn't just talk about the affair, they talked about after. After the old man's gone. Once the estate clears. David had done the math. He knew I was an only child. He knew my father had spent a lifetime being careful with money. And he had decided, somewhere in the middle of my deepest grief, That my father's death was going to be his payday, that he would wait for it, collect his comfort, and then divorce me and walk away with half of what my father spent his whole life building. He was, quite literally, waiting for my father to die so that he could profit from my grief. And Renee was sitting beside him in the waiting room of that plan, being patient. And when I dug a little deeper, because my father raised me to always read the whole contract, not just the parts someone wants you to see, I understood why David needed the estate so badly. Behind the charm, behind the ambition, behind the man who was always about to do something big, there was a different set of numbers. There were debts. A line of credit I'd never heard of, drawn down to almost nothing. 2 ventures that had quietly failed and left holes he'd been quietly filling with our shared money. The big deals he was always about to close had a habit of never closing. The man who looked, from the outside, like he was building an empire was actually treading water, and my father's careful little fortune was the rope he intended to grab. He didn't just want the inheritance. He was counting on it. He had built his entire future. And Renee's on the assumption that my grief would one day make him solvent. There was one night I nearly lost the whole plan. I was in the home office at 2 a.m, photographing a bank statement, and David came down the hall for a glass of water. I heard his footsteps, and I had maybe 3 seconds. I closed the laptop, picked up a book of my father's that I'd brought home, and when David leaned in the doorway and asked why I was up, I told him the truth. Or a piece of it, that I couldn't sleep. That I was sitting with one of Dad's old books because it made me feel close to him. And David's face softened with a sympathy I now know was entirely performed, and he said, "Get some rest. You've got a big day at the hospital tomorrow." And he went back to bed. I sat in the dark for a long time after that, my heart hammering, and I understood that I had to be more careful and faster. That was the closest it ever came to coming apart. It held, because the grieving, oblivious wife was a role I had learned to play even at 2 a.m. Now, but here is the thing that neither David nor Renee knew. The thing I didn't know either, until after the funeral. My father, that quiet, careful man who watched my husband like a contract that didn't add up, had figured it out before any of us. Not the names, not the details, but the shape of the man. And dying, with the very little energy he had left, he had chosen to spend it protecting me. A week after the funeral, my father's lawyer called me into his office. An old-fashioned room, the kind with real books in it, the kind of place my father trusted. And he told me 3 things that I have not stopped thinking about since. The first thing. In his last months, the very months I thought he was too weak to do anything but rest, my father had quietly restructured his entire estate. He left everything to me. But not in a simple, ordinary way. He left it inside a trust, structured carefully as my separate property, in a way that a spouse could not reach in a divorce, no matter what that spouse believed he was owed. He had done it deliberately, with his lawyer in writing. And the lawyer told me my father's exact words, the instruction he'd given when he set it up. He'd said, "I will not have David grieving his way into my daughter's inheritance." He knew. My careful, quiet father knew, and he never made me cry about it, and he handled it. The second thing. My father had left a letter. For me. Sealed, to be opened only after he was gone. And the lawyer slid it across the desk, and I opened it there, and I read my father's careful handwriting one last time. He wrote that he had watched David pull away while I carried everything alone. He wrote that he suspected there was someone else, that a man doesn't get that comfortable being absent unless he's comfortable somewhere else. And he wrote that he had decided not to tell me. Not because he doubted me, but because, in his words, "I am not going to spend my last weeks on this earth making my daughter cry about a man who isn't worth her tears. So I am going to do the only thing a father can still do from here. I am going to make sure that whenever you finally open your eyes, and you will, you are already standing on solid ground. And then, the line I will carry for the rest of my life, I couldn't make him a better man, Gracie. So I made sure he could never make you a poorer woman. Open your eyes. And then walk, with your head high. The third thing the lawyer told me, gently, folding his hands. He said that everything my father had built was airtight. Documented, final, that David's entire patient plan, the year of waiting, the math around the estate, the future he'd promised Renee had been quietly and completely defeated by a dying man, months before David even understood there was a fight to lose. I sat in that office and I cried for the first time in all of it. Not for my marriage. Not one tear for that. I cried for my father, who had used the last of his strength to wrap his arms around me from the other side of his own death. Now, which brings me back to the podium, and to why, when David handed me his phone to hold, I quietly slipped it into my own pocket, instead of giving it back. Because by the morning of the funeral, the affair was no longer just a private wound I was managing. David had crossed a line that even I, careful as my father taught me to be, could not let him stand comfortably behind. He had brought her. He had brought Renee, the woman who had spent a year being patient about my father's death, and seated her in a room full of people who had genuinely loved him. He had turned my father's funeral into one more comfortable afternoon inside his lie. And in my pocket, my father's last words were burning. Open your eyes. And then walk. With your head high. I had not planned, that morning, to say anything at all. I had decided weeks earlier that I would bury my father with dignity, say nothing, and let the lawyers and the trust do all the talking later, quietly, the way Dad would have preferred. I had the eulogy written a gentle one, just about him. And then David walked in with Renee on his arm and called her his support, and I felt my father's letter in my coat pocket like a coal. Open your eyes. And then walk. With your head high. Not hide them. Not look away one more time to keep the peace. Walk with your head high. And I realized that staying silent to keep a dead man's funeral comfortable for the people who'd been waiting for it was not dignity. It was just one more afternoon of pretending. So I made a different choice, standing at the back of that room, the way my father taught me slowly, on my own time, without letting anyone rush me. So when it was my turn, I walked up to that podium and I gave the eulogy my father deserved. I talked about his patience. I talked about the oil in the car and reading the contract and the right answer can wait an afternoon. I talked about a man who loved without noise, who showed up without being thanked, who spent his whole life being underestimated by louder men and never once needed them to know they were wrong. The room laughed in the right places and cried in the right places, and for a few minutes it was just us and him. And then I said there was one last thing my father had taught me, right at the very end. I said he taught me that the kindest, hardest thing you can do for someone you love is refuse to let them stay blind. And I looked up at the room, and then, calmly, at David, and at the woman beside him. And I said, my father knew my marriage was over before I did. He spent the last weeks of his life quietly protecting me from the people who were, even then, waiting for this exact day to arrive so they could profit from it. I'm not going to name anyone. I don't need to. My father wouldn't have wanted his service turned into a spectacle, and I won't do that to him. I only wanted to honor him by finally doing the thing he asked me to do, opening my eyes, in front of everyone who loved him, and standing up straight. That was all. I did not read a single message out loud. I did not shout a name. I did not need to. I simply held David's phone in my open hand the entire time I spoke, not waving it, not threatening with it, just holding it, the way you hold a thing that has the truth inside it. And every person in that room who needed to understand understood, because David's face had gone the color of paper. And Renee was staring at the floor, and the space between them on that pew suddenly looked like a canyon. The phone was never a weapon I had to fire. It was just the truth, sitting in my open palm in front of a room that had loved my father far too much to pretend along with him. Then I stepped down. I hugged the people who mattered. My mother's sister held my face in both her hands and said, "Your father would be so proud of how you stood up there." And I walked back to my seat, past my husband, who was now sitting alone, because somewhere during those 2 minutes, Renee had quietly gathered her coat and left the building, and would not be a problem either of us would have to think about for very much longer. Now, the after. Because revenge in real life is not the scene. The scene is just the moment everyone else finally sees what you already knew. The real thing happens quietly, in offices, on paper, in the weeks that follow. David tried, of course. Once the grief fog cleared and the lawyers got involved, he tried to fight. He tried to argue that the inheritance was a marital expectation. That he'd supported me emotionally through my father's illness. That phrase actually appeared in a letter from his lawyer. And I laughed out loud reading it, alone in my kitchen, the first real laugh I'd had in a year. But there was nothing to fight. My father had seen to that. The trust held exactly as it was built to hold. The documentation I had quietly gathered for 18 months meant there was no version of events David could invent that the facts didn't already contradict. His own messages, his own timeline, his own patient little plan, all of it was simply true, and the truth had been notarized long before he knew to be afraid of it. The divorce was, my lawyer said, one of the cleanest she had ever processed, not because it was painless, but because my father had made it clean before he ever died. David, who had waited more than a year for an inheritance, walked away with none of it. And with his reputation among every person we'd ever known in quiet ruins, entirely by his own hand. Renee, I heard, did not stay with him long once the comfortable future they'd been so patient about simply evaporated. There's nothing to be patient for when the prize was never real. I kept what my father left me. But more than the money, more than the house, I kept the thing he actually gave me, the dignity he asked me to keep, and the eyes he spent his last strength forcing open. A few weeks after it was all final, I went to my father's grave alone. I brought him nothing but the truth, which is the only thing he ever really wanted from anyone. I told him it was done. I told him I'd kept my head high, the way he asked. I told him I was sorry it took me so long to open my eyes, and that I understood now what he'd been trying to say in that hospital bed. And at that dinner he waited up for, and in every careful look he gave my husband for 9 years. And I sat there in the quiet for a while, and for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't carrying any of it alone, because he'd made sure of that before he ever let go of my hand. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not as someone who got her revenge, but as someone whose father loved her enough to protect her even from the far side of death, it's this. Listen to the people who watch you quietly and love you without drama, the ones who don't make a show of it. They are very often seeing the thing you are standing too close to see. And when someone shows you who they really are, even at the worst possible moment, even in a hospital waiting room, even at a funeral, believe them the first time. Open your eyes. And then, no matter how much it hurts, walk with your head high. Because the people who truly love you will spend their strength protecting you. And the ones who don't will spend it waiting for the day they can profit from your pain. Learn to tell the difference a little sooner than I did. There's one more thing, though. A few months later, when I finally had the strength to go through my father's old papers, I found a folder of his own tucked in the back of a drawer, in his careful handwriting, dated almost 2 years before he died. It was about David, and it contained something my father had quietly discovered. Long before I ever suspected a single thing was wrong, something that explained why he'd started watching my husband like a contract that didn't add up in the first place. What was in that folder, and what I finally decided to do with it, is a story entirely its own. And it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.